Ja, herzlich willkommen in den Geistesblüten. Welcome to Geistesblüten. Colonialism began about 500 years ago, and it's not even over yet. Back then, countries from Europe started to conquer territories in other parts of the world. Europeans went on voyages of discovery. Not only they went on these expensive and dangerous journeys because they were curious, they were prompted to do so by quite different motives. They wanted to expand their sphere of influence. They wanted to make profits by extracting mineral resources. They took spices, art objects, important artifacts, men, women, and children. The Europeans wanted to spread their own way of life and religion. In a second step, they wanted to establish trade relations with conquered colonies. After conquest, the natives were no longer free. The indigenous people were oppressed. They had to work for the colonial power. Many of them were enslaved. Many were murdered. Many were expelled. Colonialism sounds like a term from a bygone era. If we understand this term to mean the annexation of foreign territories and paternalism by Europeans, then not all of these interventions and their consequences have been negotiated to date. The effects of colonialism are still rampant today, but there are turning points, like the declarations of sovereignty after the French Revolution, using Haiti as an example. In 1914, more than half of the world's population was under direct colonial influence. After the end of First World War, Germany renounced its overseas colonies by signing the Treaty of Versailles. Gandhi demanded Indian independence in 1942 in return for Indian support for the British against the Germans during World War II. To show the insidious and very bloody undertakings of how the conquered rebelled against the colonial masters, I would have to correctly list all the post-World War II war sites in Africa, the uprisings, the election of Nelson Mandela as president of South Africa. We would have to talk about the founding of the UN as a concept of equal nations worldwide. We would have to talk about the fact that demands for restitution of looted art are becoming louder and louder. Examples could be given of art and artifacts that were returned. We could talk about an island like Tonga. Tonga had its own king, but was under British protectorate until it got back full autonomy in 1970. Barbados has only been a republic since 2021, and this is just 2 years. But there are still places in the world today that are kept out of the public debate as soon as it comes to reparations. But fortunately, there are human rights lawyers, human rights activists, journalists, and committed celebrities who are drawing the attention of all of us to these places. One book from which such a signal light emanates is a new book by Philippe Sands. It is called The Last Colony, A Tale of Exile, Justice in Britain's Colonial Legacy. It's powerful and elegantly written. Philippe Sands uses the story of the Chagos-Inseln Islands to tell a broader story about colonialism and international human rights from the 20th century to today. Philippe Sands ist Anwalt. Ist Professor für internationales Recht und Direktor des Center for International Courts and Tribunals am University College of London. Leidenschaftlich setzt er sich für humanitäre Ziele und das Völkerrecht ein. Er formulierte unter anderem die Anklage gegen den chilenischen Diktator Pinochet. 2016 empfahl uns Katja Riemann, wir Geistesblüten sollten unbedingt einmal East West Street, A Song of Good and Evil lesen und möglichst dazu etwas machen. Und sie hatte natürlich recht. Katja Riemann hat uns dazu gebracht, wir haben es gemacht. Philippe Sands und Katja Riemann begegneten sich und als wir das veranstalteten, hatte Philippe noch nicht mal einen deutschen Verlag, aber Mitarbeiterinnen des S. Fischer Verlags saßen in der Veranstaltung und ein Jahr später, 2017, erschien das Buch bei S. Fischer unter dem Titel Rückkehr nach Lemberg. Es ist eines der wichtigsten Bücher über die Nürnberger Prozesse. Es wurde mit dem renommierten Baillie Gifford Prize und dem Wingate Literaturpreis 2016 ausgezeichnet und Buch des Jahres bei den British Book Awards 2017. 2020 erschien bei Fischer Philippe Sands zweites Buch Die Rattenlinie, ein Nazi auf der Flucht, und wegen Corona war uns leider keine analoge Veranstaltung möglich. Aber heute mit seinem dritten Buch Die letzte Kolonie. Wir freuen uns, dass Katja Riemann wieder dabei ist, sie daraus lesen wird. Sie ist seit 2000 UNICEF-Botschafterin. Sie unterstützt unter anderem Plan International und Amnesty International. Sie setzt sich für eine offene Gesellschaft und für Menschenrechte ein, besonders für die von Mädchen und Frauen. Für ihr Engagement erhielt sie 2010 das Bundesverdienstkreuz am Band und 2016 den Bad Iburger Courage-Preis. Seit 20 Jahren ist sie auf Projektreisen rund um die Welt unterwegs. In ihrem Buch Jeder hat, niemand darf, das wir hier in den Geistesblüten auch vorstellten, beschreibt sie die Arbeit von Nichtregierungsorganisationen, erzielt von Menschen, die sie bewundert, weil genau diese Menschen im Field etwas bewegen. Im Herbst können wir uns auf mehr von Katja Riemann freuen, aber das erzähle ich Ihnen vielleicht bei der Premiere, die wir hoffentlich veranstalten dürfen. Durch den heutigen Abend führt Katrin Sohns. Sie ist Ressortleiterin Kultur beim Tagesspiegel. Ihre beiden Chefredakteure Christian Tretbar und Lorenz Marold sind heute noch aus dem Häuschen, dass sie mit ihr eine in Deutschland und international bestvernetzte Expertin für diese Stelle gefunden haben. Über 15 Jahre arbeitete Katrin Sohns als Kulturwissenschaftlerin, Kuratorin und Kulturmanagerin in der Kunst- und Kulturszene. Sie studierte an der Berliner Humboldt-Universität und an der Goldsmiths University of London. Für das Goethe-Institut arbeitete sie zunächst als regionale Leiterin des Kulturprogramms für die Region Südostasien, dann als regionale Leiterin für das Kulturprogramm der Region Nordwesteuropa. Aber jetzt ist es Zeit, dass ich die Bühne räume und Sie applaudieren für Katrin Sohns, Katja Riemann und natürlich Philippe Sands.
Dies ist eine wahre Geschichte. Erstmals erzählt in einer Reihe von Vorträgen, die ich im Sommer 2022 an der Haager Akademie für Völkerrecht hielt. Als Beteiligter an Teilen dieser Geschichte bin ich kein unabhängiger Beobachter und verstehe, dass man die Ereignisse aus unterschiedlichen Blickwinkeln betrachten und zu unterschiedlichen Deutungen erlangen kann. Ich habe versucht, eine persönliche, gleichwohl auf Fairness und Ausgewogenheit bedachte Darstellung vorzulegen. Die Geschichte, die kaum bekannt ist und ein breiteres Publikum verdient, besteht genau genommen aus einer Reihe miteinander verwobener Geschichten. Eine handelt vom Internationalen Gerichtshof in Den Haag und von dessen Rolle beim allmählichen Niedergang des Kolonialismus, wobei das Hauptaugenmerk schlussendlich auf den Fall Mauritius liegt. Eine andere ist persönlicher. Mein eigenes, sich ständig weiterentwickelndes Verhältnis zur Welt des Völkerrechts. Und eine dritte, das Herzstück dieses Buches, ist die Geschichte von Liseby Elysé. Die Geschichte des Unrechts, das ihr und anderen Chagos-Janern zugefügt wurde und von ihrer Suche nach Gerechtigkeit, die bis auf den heutigen Tag andauert. Ich habe mich bemüht einzufangen, was Madame Elysé mir während vieler gemeinsam verbrachter Stunden, in denen wir den Text und die Ereignisse durchgingen, anvertraute und unsere Freundschaft ihren Erwartungen entspricht. Wir entstanden unterschiedlichen Verhältnissen, doch unsere Wege verbanden sich über rechtsstaatliche Verfahren und Gerichtsprozesse, die allmählich den Vorhang über der Kolonialzeit schlossen, in die Madame Elysé hineingeboren wurde und in der sie lebte und in der mein Berufsleben seine Prägung lief.
Philipp, it's a real pleasure for me, yes, you're looking at me, it's a real pleasure to be sitting here with you tonight in this wonderful space of Geistesblüten. We were just exchanging what beautiful soul this space has. And I really enjoyed reading your book. The words that Katja just cited or quoted were already mapping what you did in this book. You could say it's the history of international law, but it's also the story of Liseby Elysé and the people of a very small archipelago in the Indian Ocean called Chagos. I would like to start off by asking you, how did you meet Liseby and how did you find out about her story and her case?
So first off, thank you for this conversation, and I find it so reassuring always to hear Katja's voice, because we've been doing this for a few years now, and somehow, for me, when anything German happens, the voice of Katja is very soothing, and I'm used to hearing it, and I trust you.
Impersonating Hans Frank.
You've done it on occasion. And also this wonderful bookshop, it's just so beautiful. It's incredibly lovely to be here. And my thanks, of course, to my wonderful German publishing. So I'm going to try to keep my answers brief because I tend to go on too much. But basically what happened was that in 2010, curiously, the very same month that I got an invitation to go to Lviv, and what began the journey of those books and my connections with Ukraine, that same month, while on a skiing holiday in France, while sitting on a chairlift, and I normally do not look at my phone when I'm on a chairlift because I'm terrified of dropping it, but the number was striking, plus 230. I didn't know that number. So I answered the phone, and it was the office of the Prime Minister of Mauritius, asking whether I would be available to advise the government of Mauritius and assist it in reclaiming some islands that were stolen from it 50 years earlier. And I inquired what the islands were, and he said the Chagos-Archipel, and I didn't know what the Chagos-Archipel was, much to my embarrassment. And then he said, well, you'll probably know this Diego Garcia. And Diego Garcia, of course, I did know, because it's notorious, it's where the bombing of Iraq began, and it's also a place of extraordinary rendition in the so-called War on Terror. And so one thing led to another, I accepted. In Britain, it's one of the very positive things about the United Kingdom is that it's not a problem as an English barrister or a professor to act against your own country. It's actually fine, it's cool, no one troubles you, no one has any problem. As a French person, you can't do it. I've done it on numerous occasions. I did it, for example, in 1995 when France decided to resume nuclear testing in the Pacific, and I acted against France, and I have still, to this day, nearly 30 years later, never been forgiven, and I remain on a blacklist at the Quai d'Orsay. Un Français ne plaide jamais contre son propre pays. UK has a different view, I accept it, and one thing led to another, and we eventually got to a place, and I go through the story in the book, we ended up in The Hague, at the International Court of Justice, and we felt it was absolutely crucial to understand, for the court to understand the human reality of what had happened. That in 1965, the British government, contrary to its commitments under international law and the new rules on decolonisation, decided to create a new colony, the last colony it ever created, the British Indian Ocean Territory, buyout, by severing 58 islands that had been part of the colony of Mauritius. And they did it because they wanted to give one of those islands, Diego Garcia, to the Americans as a military base. And 3 years later, Mauritius having gained its independence without the Chagos-Archipelago, they then forcibly deported the entire population. 2,000 people, all black, all descending from enslaved people, and those individuals have wanted to go back ever since. And we felt, as the lawyers, external but also the internal lawyers felt it, and the government of Mauritius felt it, it would not be appropriate to argue this case before the International Court of Justice without hearing the voice of the Chagosians. And so we engaged in a lengthy effort to find the right Chagosian, and we came across this extraordinary lady, Liseby Elysé, born in 1953, cannot read or write, is a human being of immense courage, intelligence, integrity, and she appeared before the International Court of Justice, and I think she won the case. It's an extraordinary story. I've come to know her very well.
Wonderful. You already hinted a little at where exactly this archipelago is, but just to be precise, where on the globe, where do you find this little
10,000 kilometres from London. The British constantly say, well, it's got nothing to do with Mauritius, it's 2,000 kilometres from Mauritius, which it is. It's in the Indian. It's basically in the middle of the Indian Ocean, situated between the Maldives and Madagascar. Gives you a sort of sense. But for those of you who've read the book, you'll know I've been there now, and it took 6 days to sail from the Seychelles to the Chagos-Archipel. And in those 6 days, we did not see another boat. For 6 days, it was more than 1,000 miles, except for the British boats that were chasing us. It's very, very far away. I mean, if any of you have been to the Maldives, the islands look like that. They're very low atolls ringed by coral. They would be described as paradise islands. Liseby Elysé calls it her paradise. And it is an extraordinary place.
Thank you so much. I would like to ask Katja to read some more, because I think your next section is actually Liseby speaking, right? To the court.
La Cour. Die Worte wurden an einem Sommermorgen in Den Haag feierlich von einem Mann in Amtstracht ausgerufen. Vor seiner Brust hing eine eindrucksvolle Silberkette, ein Symbol der Autorität. Wie seit vielen Jahrzehnten eingespielt, verkündete er den Einzug der Richter. In plissierten schwarzen Roben betraten sie gesetzten Schrittes den großen Saal des Friedenspalastes, wo sie sich in Reihe und Glied zu ihren Plätzen hinter einem sehr langen Tisch begaben. In ihrer Mitte der Präsident, ein ruhiger Mann aus Somalia, der aus eigener Erfahrung wusste, was es bedeutete, Empfänger britischen und italienischen kolonialen Edelmuts zu sein. Er sah sich im Gerichtssaal um, blickte auf die Reihen von Anwälten und Diplomaten, Journalisten und Übersetzern, umrahmt von riesigen Buntglasfenstern und Kristallleuchtern. Dann forderte er uns auf, Platz zu nehmen. Direkt hinter mir, in der zweiten Reihe, saß eine schwarz gekleidete, zierliche Dame. Und die kleine Handtasche, die sie umklammert hielt, verlieh ihr ein förmliches, würdevolles Aussehen. Sie war aus dem fernen Mauritius, Gesundheit, als Mitglied der Delegation dieses Staates angereist. Sie war hier, um eine Geschichte zu erzählen. Eine kurze Geschichte über ihre Jugendjahre, in der Hoffnung, dass ihr Bericht die Entscheidung der 14 Richter vielleicht in eine Richtung lenkte, die ihr ermöglichen konnte, an den Ort zurückzukehren, an dem sie geboren wurde. Ihre Heimat. Im wahren Sinne dort, wo das Herz ist. Dort war Chagos-Archipel, ein Atoll, das zu einem Archipel namens Chagos gehört, der inmitten der Weiten des Indischen Ozeans liegt. Von dort war sie vor 5 Jahrzehnten zusammen mit Hunderten anderer Chagosianer Sands umgesiedelt worden. Liseby Elysé lebte bis zu ihrem 20. Lebensjahr glücklich auf einer der Inseln von Chagos-Archipel. Dann wurde sie eines Frühlingstages ohne Vorwarnung von den britischen Behörden aus ihrem Haus geholt. Sie durfte einen einzigen Koffer mitnehmen und man befahl ihr, an Bord eines Schiffes zu gehen, das sie 1000 Meilen weg befördern würde. Die Insel wird Sperrgebiet, teilte man ihr mit. Niemand erklärte, warum. Niemand erwähnte eine neue Militärbasis, welche die Amerikaner auf einer anderen Insel des Archipels, Diego Garcia, mit britischer Erlaubnis errichten. Und niemand sagte ihr, dass Chagos, das lange zu Mauritius gehört hatte, von diesem Territorium abgetrennt worden war und nun eine neue Kolonie in Afrika war, bekannt als britisches Territorium im Indischen Ozean. Madame Elysé und die gesamte Gemeinschaft von etwa 1500 Menschen, fast alle schwarz und viele von ihnen Nachfahren versklavter Plantagenarbeiter, wurden gezwungen, ihre Heimatorte zu verlassen und deportiert. Madame Elysé war in Den Haag, um in einem ihre Inseln betreffenden Rechtsfall auszusagen. Die 14 Richter wussten noch nicht, wer sie war oder welche Rolle sie in dem Verfahren spielte. Sie würden Argumente in Bezug auf Großbritanniens letzte Kolonie in Afrika hören, erfahren, wie sie von Mauritius abgetrennt wurde, und sie würden entscheiden, ob sie völkerrechtlich zu Mauritius oder zu Großbritannien gehörte. Die Richter würden sich mit historischen Fragen und mit Aspekten der Kolonialherrschaft befassen. Und sie würden am Ende darüber urteilen, ob eine Gruppe von Menschen selbst über ihr Schicksal entscheiden durfte oder ob diese Menschen sich von anderen diktieren lassen mussten, wie ihr Leben zu verlaufen hat. Madame Elysé war eine Zeugin für Mauritius, den afrikanischen Staat, den ich in diesem Fall vertrat. Sie würde im Namen der Chagosianer sprechen, in ihrer Kreolsprache, mit Klarheit, Kraft und Leidenschaft. Weil sie weder lesen noch schreiben konnte, hatten die Richter eingewilligt, dass sie mittels einer vorher aufgezeichneten Erklärung aussagen würde. Sie würde sie währenddessen beobachten, so wie die Richter sie beobachteten. Eine Frau in einem schwarzen Kostüm und einer spitzengeränderten weißen Bluse, am Revers eine kleine blau-rote Plakette, die forderte: "Let us return." Lasst uns zurückkehren. Der Präsident eröffnete das Verfahren mit einer kurzen Zusammenfassung des Falles. Dann bat er den ersten Sprecher, sich an das Gericht zu wenden. Langsam begab sich Sir Arnaud Huguenot, 88 Jahre alt, ehemaliger Premierminister von Mauritius, Mitglied der höheren Anwaltschaft von England und Wales, Queen's Counsel, zum Podium. Er sprach exakt 15 Minuten. Es folgten 2 weitere Anwälte, eine kurze Kaffeepause und dann ein dritter Anwalt. Er und die Rechtsanwälte lasen von vorbereiteten Skripten ab, was für die Richter wie das Publikum eine gewisse Theateratmosphäre aufkommen ließ. Die Richter unterbrachen weder noch stellten sie Fragen. Dann begab ich, Philippe, sich zum Podium. Ich hatte schon viele Male zu diesem Gericht gesprochen, war diesmal jedoch angespannter als sonst. Madame Elysé, die jetzt in der ersten Reihe saß, stand kurz auf, als ich sie vorstellte. Das Gericht sollte die Stimme der Chagosianer direkt hören, sagte ich, damit es ein Gespür für die Realitäten der Kolonialherrschaft bekommen würde. Madame Elysées Erklärung wurde auf 2 große Bildschirme projiziert, die über den Richtern hingen. Worte und Bilder wurden weltweit ausgestrahlt. Im fernen Port-Louis, der Hauptstadt von Mauritius, wurde das Verfahren live im Staatsfernsehen übertragen. Und die Freunde von Madame Elysé hatten sich zum Zuschauen in einem Gemeindezentrum versammelt. Sie weinten, als sie sprach. M'appelle Liseby Elysé. Mein Name ist Liseby Elysé. Ich wurde am 24. Juli 1953 auf Perros Baños geboren. Mein Vater wurde auf Sizilien geboren. Meine Mutter wurde auf Perros Baños geboren. Meine Großeltern wurden auch dort geboren. Ich gehöre zur Delegation von Mauritius. Ich erzähle nun, wie ich gelitten habe, seit ich von meiner paradiesischen Insel entwurzelt worden bin. Ich bin froh, dass der Internationale Gerichtshof uns heute anhört. Und ich bin zuversichtlich, dass ich auf die Insel zurückkehren werde, auf der ich geboren wurde. You understood?
I did. It's lovely hearing you in German.
Oh, it's wonderfully read. Thank you, Katja. So you all got an idea of the rather small and at the same time big case of this strong woman who fought for her right of the land. Philippe, you in your book you start with this episode and you then go back all the way to 1945. You start off by explaining how country by country the Global South tried to detach from their colonial ties. Could one say that the fight against National Socialism helped to strengthen the anti-colonial powers back at that time?
Well, That's an interesting question. Certainly the events of 33 to 45 contributed to the moment that gave rise to the meeting that Churchill and Roosevelt held off the coast of Newfoundland in 1941, where they signed a single piece of paper and called it the Atlantic Charter, and that declared the origins of what would come to be known as the right of self-determination. Roosevelt and Churchill had a very different interpretation of what they'd signed. Churchill went back to England, and in relation to the paragraph that expressed the commitment to ensure that all peoples decided for themselves how they were governed, he assured the Parliament in Westminster that this line did not apply to Britain. It was only going to apply to people who lived under Nazi rule. And as he said that, another man in South Africa, Nelson Mandela, had found a cutting in a newspaper of this article and interpreted it as Roosevelt had interpreted it. And the paragraph in the Atlantic Charter then became the commitment 4 years later in the United Nations Charter. But I want to come back, so it's a way of saying, yes, I think plainly there is a connection. And I want to come back to the relationship between my previous books and this book in due course, because I think there is a powerful connection. One of the reasons I know that Liseby Elysé resonated so powerfully for me was a moment early on when we knew each other, and she described to me what had happened to her on her island of Pelos Banhos exactly 50 years ago from now, April 1973. For the first time she saw a white person on her island. That had never happened before. And the white person said to her that the island was being closed, that she would have to leave tomorrow with everybody, and she would be allowed to take one suitcase. And those words, I remember when she said it to me, really resonated. Those of you who've read Rückgabe nach Lemberg will know that in July 1942, my grandfather's mother heard exactly the same thing in Vienna before being deported. And so this image of an elderly lady, although Liseby was young at the time, being told you're allowed to go with one suitcase tomorrow, really immediately built a bond. I told her about it, actually. We talked about it a lot. She's a really very acute individual. It's very important for me to explain why I started in this way in the book. There is a big issue, particularly in the Anglo-Saxon world, in terms of these historical issues, and in particular, an acute conscience, for me, as a white man, privileged, dealing with a case that involves the mistreatment of people who happen to be black. How do you, it's one thing to be professionally involved as a barrister doing a case, it's quite another thing when you write a book. And there's a big issue about a white guy who's privileged writing a book about a black lady who comes from a different background. And in fact, when I wrote the proposal for the book and it went out to the publishers that I've worked with very consistently over the years, my American publisher, Alfred Knopf, said they couldn't publish this book. They could not publish a book about the story of a black lady written by a white guy. This was exactly at the time of Black Lives Matter. I said, fine, I actually don't agree with that, but I totally respect the decision and I accept your decision. And I remember talking about it with Liseby and explaining to her what had happened, and she said, but that's just ridiculous, I don't understand that, I can't read and I can't write, someone's got to tell me the story. And I explained to her, and then she sort of understood, and then Knopf changed their mind. And the reason the book's coming out only in September now in the United States is precisely because of the delay for them to come to terms with that. So there's an acute awareness of avoiding a sense of white saviour. The white guys from London coming along, sorting out the case, 50 years after it all happened. And I'm at great pains in the book to explain they want the case. Liseby Elysé's testimony won the case, and also all the litigation they've done in the English courts, actually, ultimately unsuccessfully, nevertheless produced a vast number of documents by a process called discovery, when you can go to court and say, we need to see these internal documents. And it was their efforts which threw up the documents which the International Court of Justice relied upon. And this is really important for me, but equally important is that the book had to begin and end with the words of Liseby Elysé. And this, you'll understand exactly what I'm saying. There's a real complexity right now. And in particular, a fear about a sort of recolonizing of the story. The national of the original colonial power then accords to himself the right to tell the story. There's a problem. And I consulted very widely with people about it, and everyone basically said the main thing is to acknowledge your recognition of this issue, and once you've acknowledged it, it should be fine. But I am a little anxious about the book coming out in the United States in September and how that will go, because racial politics in the United States right now are extremely acute. And there's a real issue of whether Liseby comes to the United States, which she really wants to do. She's never been on a book tour in America, and so she's really keen to do it. But how one handles that, I think, is really...
Might emphasize also the dynamics in a way too. Yeah.
Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, she's in private, she's got really strong views about things, and she shares them forcefully. She's not a shy little thing, but in a place where there's a larger public and so on and so forth, she was very anxious about appearing before the court. And in fact, again, this gives you a sense of how these things work. It was really interesting. So the way that it works in the international court is you're given a time slot, 2 hours and 40 minutes, to make your arguments to the court, which means the entire thing is completely scripted. There's no spontaneity. You read from a text, but Liseby can't read. So, okay, how do we deal with that? And she's gorgeous, but once she starts talking, she doesn't stop. And we couldn't have a situation where she starts talking and carries on talking, and then we had to rush off and turn off the microphone. I mean, that would be totally inappropriate. So we wrote to the court and asked whether she could do something that hadn't been done before, which is pre-record a statement. And it was delivered in this way. And she was actually really pleased about that, because she was incredibly anxious. So the scene was remarkable. So she was in court, and she's watching the judges watching her. And that's been really interesting to talk with the judges afterwards, once the case was all over, and you can talk to them about how that experience was. And interestingly, just 2 weeks ago, I met someone who works at the court, who said that now, 4.5 years on, people are still talking about that experience, of how that happened. It left such a profound impact. I've never experienced anything like it. The silence after she stopped talking was like, we all know that very rare experience of going to a concert or going to the theatre, and there's a particular moment when the performers have connected with the audience, where there's a special silence. You know something big is happening, and that's what happened at the end. You know that. And it was that, and you knew there was a connection at the most profound of levels. And again, we were very, very fortunate. I mentioned in the book, these things normally one doesn't write about in a law academic text. The president was from Somalia, and he was black. And this made a big difference, because when he came in and presided, all of a sudden Liseby sees someone, and I asked her later on, and I put it in the book, did you have any connection with him? And she said, absolutely. I said, what? She said, we made eye contact, and I felt safe. And so these things that in law books, for those of you who are lawyers, you know, we never talk about these things, but they're actually hugely important. They're hugely important.
But this was actually for me one of the big learning curves from your book also, amongst many others. But like you say, we often think that law is very rigid and very strategic and very clear. And you describe so movingly in how it really matters who sits in these courts and how it has actually changed over the years that you have been working in them.
Well, I think it's, I've written this book for many, many reasons. The main reason that I wrote it is it's a sort of act of literary advocacy. Because when we got the decision that we wanted, spoiler alert, it was a great decision in favour of Liseby, the Chagos-Inseln and the Mauritians. The British said, no, we don't recognise this, we're not going to implement this. And I decided to write a book because I've learnt with East West Street and Kolonie that you can reach a much bigger audience by writing for non-lawyers in a way that's accessible, and you can influence things. And so that was why I decided to write the book, and that purpose was extremely important. But another purpose was, basically I wanted my students to understand how it really is, not what you get in the law textbooks, which bears no relation to the world as happens in a domestic courtroom or an international courtroom. Believe it or not, judges are human beings, lawyers are human beings, and there is this sort of interaction that takes place, and a conversation that is not articulated in words. It's like being an actor on stage. There's some conversation that's taking place that's not in written words or spoken words, but which is going on. And it's that I'm interested in. And I went back to a dramatically terrible decision of 1966, an infamous case of the International Court of Justice. It's called the Southwest Africa case. Obviously a case with a particular resonance in a German context, because it is Namibia, it was German Southwest Africa, it's where the Herero people live. This is, maybe we can come on to this in due course. And in 1960, Ethiopia and Liberia brought a case against South Africa to argue that South Africa's mistreatment of the black population of Southwest Africa, a colony of Southwest Africa, discrimination, apartheid, was a violation of international law. And almost unbelievably, the International Court of Justice ruled it did not have the competence to receive the case. And for 25 years after that, no countries from the Global South went to the International Court of Justice. And actually, I can tell you, because I've just been advising the government of Ethiopia on something else, their position today, 57 years later, is they will never go to the International Court of Justice for anything because of the court's decision to deny them standing in relation to that issue. So the politics of a court in a domestic sense and in an international sense are a big part of the reality of international relations. And this case is a case I'm now realizing of singular importance in describing a changed world, because it has opened the door to countries from the Global South to feel comfortable about going to an international court and taking on one of the permanent members of the Security Council.
Mm-hmm. One thing that I was wondering while reading the book is you really describe this David against Goliath setting with this petite but strong woman fighting the international law. It's a very banal question, but who finances these? Who finances you when you?
It was the government of Mauritius.
Okay.
Because only states have standing before international courts. And so the government of Mauritius finances it out of its tax revenues and its general budget, and has done that for 13, 14 years. And this raises a really interesting question, you know, for me and for all of us. We are not the lawyers for the Chagosians. We're not the lawyers for Liseby Elysé. We're the lawyers for Mauritius. What happens if there is a tension, as there will always be in relations between the government of a country and a community in that country? At what point does an issue arise? So far that has not arisen, but you need to be aware that the Chagosian community, tiny as it is is not a united community. So they're basically divided into three different parts. There are those who accept that they are part of Mauritius, and Chagos is part of Mauritius. There's a whole community living in the United Kingdom who, for various reasons, have concluded they're better off if Chagos stays part of the United Kingdom. And so they have opposed the case brought by Mauritius. And then there's a third group, which is very small but nevertheless relevant, who say we don't want to be part of Mauritius, we don't want to be part of the United Kingdom, we want to be our own country. Self-determination means the ability to decide for ourselves. So Mauritius has aligned itself with Liseby's community, which wants to be part of Mauritius, but there's another community out there which has a completely different view, and it was very painful during the hearings. We would turn up at the International Court of Justice, the hearings last a couple of weeks, and there'd be a group of Chagosians outside the courtroom who were not allowed in, who were part of the, we want to be part of the United Kingdom, Mauritius is a totally racist country, it's run by Hindus, they hate us, why would we want to be part of Mauritius? But the British had done nothing to give them access to the International Court. They hadn't put them on their delegation, they hadn't given them passes, so they weren't able to get into the courtroom, and they asked Mauritius for help in getting them into the courtroom, even though they were arguing. I mean, it was, at a human level, what's happened is so disgraceful. I mean, irrespective of what your view is and which of the different parts of the community you agree or disagree with, what Britain has done is just absolutely disgusting. And one of the things I felt a real responsibility for is just, I had no idea about this case. How could it be that I, an educated, reasonably intelligent person, knowledgeable about these kinds of things, had never come across the story? And so I went back, and I describe it in the book, about my own education, of going back to look at my school books to find out what I was taught. And it's completely shocking. I keep things because I come from a sort of like refugee type family, and so you keep any book that's ever been given to you. And I went back and I had my school book, Geoffrey Treece, This Is Your Century, published in 1966. We dealt with it in 1972. And I think it's about chapter 13 or 16, I can't remember. I've quoted from it in the book. It's just appalling. And the chapter is called Sunset on Empire. And it's really... and it begins with a sort of comparison about India. And this fantastic man who governed India for several years, Viscount Mountbatten, magnificent specimen of a man, compared to the new bloke, small, vegetarian, a pacifist, looks like a monkey with glasses. That's what I read. So, like, whoa. Is it any surprise that my generation, we were just told Britain was great, and that was it. And my kids actually get pretty much, they're in their 20s, they get pretty much the same stuff. And if you want to understand Brexit, this is the key. Because it is about a country that has simply not even begun to come to terms with the past. Many aspects of it are great, and there are many fabulous people. But it has not been able to open the door on acts that it has done in the past, and so it occupies a space in which, even when you publish a book like this, people are like, I thought you wrote about Nazis. Why are you writing about this? And they have real trouble. And in fact, my favourite review was from the dreaded Daily Telegraph, which of course you know all about, Katrin. And it was actually a pretty favourable review. The guy was a barrister, and he was a very right-wing barrister, but he couldn't really find much to say was wrong or anything. So it was quite a decent review, but he didn't have control of the heading, the article heading, which which is absolutely brilliant. The article heading, you'll love this, the article heading is Britain is not Nazi Germany. Okay. I mean, like when they say that in the book, when did I draw the comparison? And they'd obviously, they'd obviously just thought, oh, this guy writes books about Nazis, now he's writing a book about British colonialism, and so he's drawing that comparison. And we just want our readers to know, just in case there's any doubt. And I've understood a lot, actually, in writing this book. It's made me understand the place that Nazism has in British society. The Nazis are terrific in Britain because they make Britain feel good about itself. Look, there's people who did even worse things than us. And that is how the National Socialist period, I've come to understand, is used in the United Kingdom. And it's been a real eye-opener for me to understand the interrelationship between stories that don't appear on their face to be connected, but nevertheless I think are deeply connected.
Well, you covered so much now. It would also be really interesting to discuss on how German colonialism is treated in German school books. But can we just briefly go back to this very moment, to this dirty business when UK decided to make this little island their territory? And also, why did they want to give it to the US? Why was it strategically so important at this very point? Maybe also mention the time again that we're in.
So if you go back to the early 1960s, the government of Harold Wilson has decided not to participate in the war in Vietnam. And so they're under real pressure from the Americans to be seen to be doing something. And secondly, they've got this newfangled policy of creating submarines armed with nuclear weapons, but they don't actually have the technology to do it themselves, and they need American technology. Polaris is what it's called. And so they sort of need to be nice to the Americans. And the Americans come along and they've got a policy of placing military bases on distant atolls and islands, and they say, we like that one, we want that one. Actually, the Americans say, we just want one island, and you don't have to get rid of the population except on that island. But the British then say, you can have it, you can have the island, we'll give you the island. And the logic of the British position is as follows, because the British are very legalistic. And so there will have been two lawyers, Mr. Austen and Mr. Darwin, who are charged with working out how to deal with the situation. And their position basically is that as at that point, in 1965, new rules have come into being, or principles, which may not be yet legally binding, that was one of the issues in the case, that mean if we're going to dismember part of a colony, which we're basically not allowed to do, we have to maintain the principle of territorial integrity and give the entire colony independence. In order to avoid doing that, we need the consent of the affected population. So, well, the lawyers divide, basically. One lawyer says you can do it, one lawyer says you can't do it. But the governments tend to do that. They tend to get advice from two people so that they can follow the one they want to advise. And they follow Mr. Austen. And Mr. Austen's advice is we can get around this by deciding that there's no population. We will recharacterize every human being who lives on the Chagos-Archipelago as a contract labourer, not a resident. And therefore they have no right to be consulted. So even if they're 2 years old, they become a contract labourer. This is what they've done. It's unbelievable. It's literally unbelievable. And, there's no population. We don't have to ask. They're workers, so they have no right to be asked. So we don't have to ask them. We just remove them. That's what happened. And that was how they got around the issue, with the complicity of the Americans. Right now, I mean, the Germans were not complicit in it, but right now the German government is having a bit of a difficulty, frankly, because the British and the Germans are completely the British and the Americans are completely isolated on this at the United Nations, and the German government which of course is committed to the idea of the rule of law, nevertheless doesn't want to upset the American friends, and so they're thinking, oh, what do we do here? And so they're caught between a rock and a hard place, and they're trying to straddle, both sides, the countries in Africa, the rule of law, countries of the global south. And the real issue that has arisen, I'm laughing about it because it's so pathetic. Just to bring it right up to date. So the decision comes down from the International Court of Justice, and the British government says, no, it's not binding on us, we can ignore this, we're not going to. And then they decide to do nothing. And then suddenly, 2 months after this book comes out, they do a total 180-degree change. And they suddenly say to Mauritius, okay, now we're ready to have conversations with you about how you resume your sovereignty and the Chagos-Inseln can go back, blah, blah, blah. I would love to be able to tell you that the publication of this book caused Her Majesty's government to change its position. That is not what happened. What happened was that Russia invaded and occupied Ukraine. And having done that, when the British go off to visit their African friends and their South American friends and their Asian friends and say, jolly good, we'd like your help to remove these wretched Russians from their illegal occupation of Ukraine. And I've had this from heads of state, heads of government, foreign ministers. They'll say, that's really interesting. So let's see if we've understood this correctly. You would like us to help you remove Russia from its illegal occupation of Ukraine, but you're going to carry on illegally occupying part of Africa? No, fuck off. And that is part of the reason why there's very little support in Africa for what's going on right now in relation to Ukraine. It is a manifest double standard and a total hypocrisy, without even mentioning Iraq, as to the standards that are to be applied in relation to these issues. So basically the British government has had to change its position on Chagos in order to look as though it is vaguely coherent in relation to Ukraine. So this is the reality of how the world works and operates. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's a very something you can really feel when you live in the global south. These double standards of the West are very present constantly, and I think currently we're witnessing how Putin is very successful with his campaign, really, to use the Western double standards, to misuse the double standard. We've done it to ourselves. Yes, I agree. Yeah.
We have done it.
But he's cleverly using the tactics. Yeah.
But we have done it to ourselves.
Yeah.
I think you all notice, so we're constantly zooming in and out, but that is what I found so fascinating, how this little island really is part of a whole global dimension in history, etc., etc. Also during the invasion, during Afghanistan war, this island always has some rules, some role in the global history. So it's very fascinating to read. Something more moving is that suddenly the UK also in these whole negotiations has these ideas of tours for the Chagosians to return to their island. And you can even watch it on YouTube. It's very touching on these first moments when Liseby and her families and friends can go back. Maybe you want to say a few words because you were also part of the...
Well, no, there's two different aspects important. So for 50 years, they were not allowed to go back. And the British government organised what they called heritage visits.
Yes.
We let the little children come back and see the island for half an hour, and then so Liseby and her wonderful nephew Olivier Bancoud, who had done all of the litigation for 25 years, before the English courts. They're famous cases. Bonku number 1, Bonku number 2, Bonku number 3, Bonku number 4, Bonku number 5, and so on. And some of them he won, some of them he lost, and I mean, extraordinary. And I met him, and I had known him for 3 or 4 years, and at a certain point, I said to him, so where did you do your legal training? And he looked at me and he said, what do you mean? And I said, well, he said, I'm an electrician. And it just reminded me, this sort of sense that we create about the sort of myth of the law.